Welcome to another episode of Shadows of the Tarot. Beth's love for her husband had been profound, a bond that defined her life in ways she hadn't fully understood until it was gone. Since Stuart's passing, she had leaned heavily on her son Brett, drawing strength from his presence. Over the years, what began as solace had hardened into dependency, and her attachment had grown into something more fraught, a possessiveness born from fear. Her grief had transformed into a consuming reliance, and Brett's every decision, every move, became a tether she struggled to hold onto, even as it began to pull him further away. She often found herself replaying the day Stuart died, unable to let go of the vivid details. It had been a sweltering summer afternoon, the kind of day where the air felt heavy and still. Stuart, stubborn as always, had insisted on mowing the back lawn despite her protests. "Stuart, it's too hot," she had called to him from the kitchen doorway. "I'll be fine," he'd replied, waving her off with a smile. "The garden needs tending, and I'm not waiting another day." He loved his garden. It was his pride, his retreat. Watching him push the mower across the grass, Beth had shaken her head and gone back inside, telling herself he would come in soon, flushed and proud of his work. When the sound of the mower stopped abruptly, Beth didn't think much of it at first. She assumed he had finished, taking a break to admire his work. But after several minutes of silence, a nagging worry crept into her chest. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes from a harsh sunlight, and immediately saw him lying still on the freshly cut lawn. "Stuart!" she screamed, rushing to his side. Her heart raced as she knelt down, her hands trembling as she checked for a pulse. Nothing. Panic set in, but she forced herself to act. She began CPR, her breaths shallow as she pressed against his chest, willing him to respond. She grabbed her phone and dialed for an ambulance, her voice frantic as she described the situation. When the paramedics arrived, their solemn faces told her everything she needed to know. They tried to comfort her, assuring her she had done all she could, but their words felt hollow. Stuart was gone. A massive heart attack, they said. He likely hadn't felt a thing. Beth's world shattered that day. The vibrant man who had been her partner, her anchor, was gone. All she had left was Brett, her 10-year-old son, who had lost his father too soon. From that day forward, Beth and Brett became inseparable. She poured all her love and energy into raising him, trying to shield him from the pain of their loss while leaning on him for emotional support she didn't realize she needed. In many ways, Brett became a stand-in for Stuart, not by design but by necessity. They did everything together, and she became fiercely protective of him, determined to keep him close. But now Brett had met Linda. Beth first learned about Linda through an offhand comment Brett made during dinner one evening. "There's someone I want you to meet," he had said, his tone cautious. Her heart sank before she even asked the question. "Who is she?" "Her name's Linda," Brett replied, avoiding her gaze. "We've been seeing each other for a while now. I think you'll like her." Beth smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She wanted to be happy for him, she truly did. But the thought of Brett building a life with someone else, someone who wasn't her, filled her with a quiet panic she couldn't shake. When she finally met Linda, Beth found her to be kind, intelligent, and warm. She could see why Brett was drawn to her. But Linda's presence was a reminder of the inevitable. Brett was building a life that didn't center around his mother. Beth tried to hide her unease, but it seeped out in small ways, a passive-aggressive comment here, an overly critical observation there. She told herself she was just being protective, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. She was afraid. Afraid of being alone. Afraid that Brett would leave, and she would have no one left to fill the gaping void Stuart's death had left behind. One evening, as Brett and Linda sat on the couch, laughing at something on the television, Beth watched from the kitchen doorway. She felt like an outsider in her own home, a spectator to a bond that didn't include her. The realization stung, and for the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong to hold on so tightly to Brett all these years. But letting go felt impossible. Brett was her lifeline, her connection to the world. Without him, She didn't know who she was anymore. As the days passed, Beth struggled to navigate her emotions. She wanted Brett to be happy, but she also wanted to keep him close. She couldn't help but feel that Linda was taking him away from her, even though she knew it wasn't fair. Her love for Brett had always been selfless, but now it felt tangled in a web of grief, fear, and possessiveness she didn't know how to escape. And so she stood at a crossroads, torn between holding on and letting go, knowing that either choice would come with its own kind of heartbreak. Beth had tried to be friendly to Linda. She really had. But no matter how hard she tried, a nagging feeling lingered in her mind. Linda wasn't right for her son. Then again, who would be? No one could possibly measure up to her expectations for Brett, not after everything they'd been through together. What would Beth do if Brett wasn't there? That question haunted her during quiet moments, the ones where the house felt too empty, too still. The thought of being alone terrified her. Linda was already talking about wanting Brett to get their own place, a home that didn't include Beth. Every time she thought about it, a knot tightened in her chest. Brett had met Linda at a line dancing club, a hobby he'd picked up to push himself out of his comfort zone. They'd clicked instantly, sharing a rhythm that carried them through the dance floor and into each other's lives. They were deeply in love, and Beth could see that love in the way Brett looked at Linda. But Linda kept nudging him, urging him to take steps that Beth wasn't ready for. "Brett, you need to have a life of your own," Linda had said one evening, her voice gentle but firm. "I know you love your mom, but you're not responsible for looking after her for the rest of your life. She'll be okay. You need to think about what you want." Beth had overheard the conversation through the thin walls of their house. Linda's words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they were. She did depend on Brett, too much perhaps, but how could she not? He was all she had. And yet, the idea of Brett choosing Linda over her filled her with a desperation she couldn't shake. After weeks of silently observing Linda and forming her conclusions, Beth decided to confront Brett. She waited for the right moment, though her emotions simmered just below the surface. One evening, while Brett was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone, Beth sat across from him and began her plea. "Brett, I need to talk to you about Linda," she started, her voice carefully measured. Brett looked up, already bracing himself. "Mom, don't start." "Just hear me out," she interrupted. "I know you love her, but I don't think she's right for you. What kind of life do you think you'll have with her? She can't even cook, Brett. You've seen how she is when she stays here. She doesn't make the bed, she doesn't iron your clothes. How are you going to manage with someone like that?" Brett sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Mom, it's not the 1950s. I don't need someone to cook or iron for me." Beth pressed on, undeterred. "She doesn't even have a stable job. She bounces from cafe to cafe, waitressing until she gets fired or quits. How is that going to give you any security? How can you build a future with someone who can't even hold down a job?" "She's trying, Mom," Brett said, his tone firmer now. "She's figuring things out, just like everyone else. You can't judge her for that." Beth shook her head, frustration bubbling over. "You don't have anything in common except that bloody line dancing. You don't even like the same movies. What kind of relationship is that?" "Mom, there's more to life than movies." Brett snapped, finally losing his patience. He took a deep breath, softening his tone. "Look, I know you're worried, but I love her. And I love you too. I'll always love you. I'll visit, I'll call, I'll be there for you. But I need a life of my own. Surely you understand that." Beth stared at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She tried to understand, truly she did, but the thought of Brett leaving cut her to the core. As the days passed, Beth found herself scrutinizing Linda's every move, searching for flaws she could use to sway Brett. Whenever Linda forgot to clean up after herself or said something Beth deemed irresponsible, Beth made sure Brett heard about it. "Did you see how she left the dishes in the sink again?" she'd say casually. Or, I heard her talking about quitting that cafe job. Does she ever stick to anything? But no matter what Beth said, Brett wouldn't listen. He'd brush off her comments, sometimes defending Linda, other times just walking away. Linda, for her part, remained patient but distant, sensing the tension and choosing not to engage. Beth resented her for that calmness, for the way she seemed unfazed by Beth's attempts to drive a wedge between them. One evening, after another failed attempt to change Brett's mind, Beth sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty chair where Stuart used to sit. She clutched a framed photo of him, her fingers tracing his smiling face. "What would you do, Stuart?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "How do I let him go?" But there was no answer, only the silence of the house that now felt too big for one person. Linda had always tried to bridge the distance between herself and Beth. She wanted to make an effort, to foster a connection, and one day, she decided to invite Beth to a local fair. Beth hesitated, her reluctance clear. The thought of spending time with Linda, of getting to know her better, wasn't appealing, but Linda was persistent, her enthusiasm hard to ignore. Eventually, Beth gave in and agreed to go. The fair was a vibrant whirlwind of colors and sounds. Stalls lined the pathways, brimming with jewelry that sparkled in the sunlight, racks of vibrant clothing, and the tantalizing aroma of food wafting through the air. Linda lingered over the trinkets and outfits, her eyes lighting up as she admired them. Beth couldn't help but feel a flicker of disdain. Linda seemed so sure that Brett could afford to buy her anything she wanted. Foolish girl. As they wandered, a small weathered sign caught their attention. Tarot readings by Elise. Beth had never had her cards read before, though the idea had always intrigued her. She felt a strange pull, and when Linda suggested they give it a try, she agreed. Elise, the tarot reader, greeted them warmly but explained there would be a half-hour wait. Beth didn't mind and suggested they grab something to eat while they waited. Over sandwiches and tea, Linda launched into an endless monologue about her plans with Brett, how they'd been looking at apartments, envisioning their life together, and dreaming of starting a family. Her voice brimmed with excitement, but each word landed like a dagger in Beth's chest. She sat silently, the weight of Linda's words pressing down on her. How could Brett build a life with someone else? What would she do without him? Her evenings had always been spent with Brett, eating dinner together, watching TV, sharing quiet moments before bed, always ending with an "I love you." The thought of those routines vanishing was unbearable. When they returned to Elise's booth, Beth was almost relieved to have something else to focus on. The reading began with Elise laying out the cards for the past, the present, and the future. Beth listened as Elise interpreted the spreads, some things resonating, others feeling distant or unclear. Then Elise reached for a small ornate tin box. "These are my special antique cards," she explained, her voice soft with reverence. "They're reserved for a final card, one that offers deeper insight." Beth took the cards, her hands trembling slightly as she shuffled. When she revealed the final card, it was the Empress. Elise's expression softened, and she explained the card's significance. "This is a powerful omen," she said. "It speaks of love, creativity, and nurturing. To move forward, you'll need to channel these energies, to embrace your talents, your feminine side, and your motherly instincts. It's a call to step into your power." Elise suggested Beth take a photo of the card to keep as a reference, and Beth did, unsure of what to make of it all but feeling a faint stir of something, hope perhaps. Meanwhile, Brett and Linda had found the perfect home. It was everything they wanted and within their budget. Brett knew the time had come to break the news to Beth, though he dreaded her reaction. That evening, he cooked dinner for the two of them, hoping to soften the blow. Once they were both seated, and he thought Beth seemed calm enough, he told her. In 2 weeks, he would be moving out to start his new life with Linda. Beth felt the world tilt. Her stomach churned, and she begged Brett to reconsider. Tears streaming down her face, she pleaded with him, explaining that the house was big enough for all of them to live together. There was no need for him to leave. They could all coexist. But Brett shook his head, his tone steady but firm. "It's not about you, Beth," he said. "Linda and I need a place of our own. This is just something we have to do." Beth couldn't understand. She couldn't imagine her life without Brett, and as his words sank in, a hollow ache began to grow inside her, a pain she wasn't sure she would ever be able to escape. Beth decided to invite Linda over, hoping for one last chance to talk some sense into her. The meeting began pleasantly enough, with the two women sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, steaming cups of tea in hand. Beth spoke earnestly, her voice trembling as she laid out what she believed were the undeniable advantages of them all living together. "Think about it," she urged, her eyes searching Linda's face for any sign of agreement. "You and Brett wouldn't have to pay a bond or even rent. We'd be financially secure, and you could be like a daughter to me. I'd teach you everything, Linda. You'd never have to feel like you were alone in this." Her voice faltered, and she continued more softly, almost pleading, "Brett's been my rock since my husband passed. We've been through everything together. I don't know what I'd do without him." But Linda's expression remained resolute. "Beth, we appreciate everything, but Brett and I need our own life. This isn't about shutting you out. It's just something we have to do." Beth sat in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks. Linda didn't flinch, her resolve unwavering. The rejection stung, and with it came a rising wave of emotion Beth hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just grief or loss, it was rage. A fiery knot twisted in her stomach, her thoughts spiraling as the reality of losing Brett consumed her. Her hands trembled as she tried to keep her composure, distracting herself with dinner preparations. At the counter, she began chopping meat for a casserole, her knife slicing mechanically through the chunks. But her thoughts were elsewhere, looping over and over. This would be the last meal she'd prepare for Brett. Soon he'd be gone, taken by this woman, this interloper who had come into her life and stolen the only family she had left. The anger festered, dark and consuming. Her hands tightened on the knife. A sudden, unbidden urge surged through her, startling in its intensity. Do something about Linda. Do it now. Before she could stop herself, Beth turned and approached Linda, who sat talking cheerfully about her plans with Brett, oblivious to the storm brewing behind her. Beth's grip on the knife tightened, her hands trembling as she raised it. But just as she moved to strike, Linda seemed to sense something. Agile and quick, Linda shot up from her chair, narrowly dodging the blow. The blade grazed her side, barely marking her, but the shock of the attack sent them both into a panicked struggle. The knife clattered to the floor, and in the scramble, Linda grabbed it. Beth lunged for the weapon, but Linda, acting purely on instinct and terror, thrust the blade forward. The knife sank into Beth's neck. For a moment, everything was still. Then the blood came, gushing in thick, hot streams as Beth crumpled to the floor. Linda froze, staring at her hands, the knife, and the spreading pool of red beneath Beth. Panic seized her as she dropped the weapon and stumbled backward. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What have I done?" She hadn't meant to hurt Beth. She was only defending herself, but the weight of her actions pressed down on her like a vice. Desperately, she called for an ambulance, though deep down, she knew it was already too late. She couldn't stay. Her mind raced with the consequences, the shame, the impossible conversation she would have to have with Brett. Grabbing her coat, she fled the house, jumping into her car and driving aimlessly, the shock numbing her to the reality of what had just happened. For hours, she drove, her thoughts spinning in chaotic circles, trying to invent a version of the truth the police might believe. But there was no escaping it. Eventually, Linda returned home, sitting in the dark and waiting for the inevitable. When the knock on the door came, she opened it without hesitation. At the station, Brett sat stunned as the police delivered the news. His mother, Beth, had been stabbed to death. "How?" he stammered, struggling to process the words. The officers explained there was no sign of an intruder, but a neighbor had seen Linda enter the house and leave hours later in a panicked rush. Brett's heart sank. "Linda wouldn't," he started, shaking his head. She and Beth had a good relationship. We were about to move out, that's all. This has to be a mistake. But the police were already en route to Linda's house. When they brought her in, Linda recounted her version of events. Beth attacked me, she said, her voice trembling. She tried to stab me first. I only fought back because I had to. I didn't mean to kill her. The officers weren't convinced. There wasn't a single mark on Linda, not even a scratch. She'd been wearing a leather jacket, which had deflected Beth's attack, and the lack of visible wounds made her story difficult to believe. Linda was formally charged, the weight of her actions now inescapable. Linda was ultimately charged with manslaughter after a long and arduous deliberation by the jury. Her sentencing was a somber affair, the courtroom heavy with unspoken emotions. She was sent to jail, and the world Brett had envisioned, one where he would start a new life with Linda, crumbled to dust. Now, Brett sat alone in his mother's house, the echoes of her presence haunting every corner. He had lost everything: his mother, the woman he loved, and the future he had so carefully planned. The house felt unbearably quiet, its silence pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. Across town, Detective Eddie, formerly Edward, was at his desk, methodically closing out Beth's case. Eddie wasn't his birth name. His parents had christened him Edward, a name steeped in tradition, though it never suited him. As a child, he endured endless teasing from his classmates, who would bow mockingly and call him King Edward. The name felt like a burden, a relic of a time he wanted no part of. When he came of age, Edward legally changed his name to Eddie, shedding the weight of history for something that felt distinctly his. Still, a fragment of that royal moniker lingered in his psyche. Secretly, he carried a desire to live up to the name, not as a literal king, but as the king of detectives. It was a strange aspiration, but it fueled him. He dreamed of ascending to the role of chief of police, a position he believed would give him the power to create meaningful change within the department and beyond. Eddie's motivations were deeply personal. He had grown up in a tough neighborhood, surrounded by crime and its devastating effects on families and communities. His father, a police officer, had been killed in the line of duty when Eddie was just a boy. The loss shaped him, instilling both a profound sense of justice and a simmering rage against the injustices of the world. As a detective, Eddie had made a name for himself quickly. His sharp instincts and relentless work ethic set him apart. Standing 6 feet tall, with a muscular build honed by years of dedication to fitness, he carried himself with quiet authority. His short, dark brown hair was often slightly tousled, giving him a rugged, approachable appearance. Eddie's leather shoulder holster was always at the ready, housing his service weapon, and his weathered notebook, filled with meticulous notes from countless cases, was never far from reach. Today, as he sorted through the last pieces of evidence from Beth's case, Eddie's attention lingered on her mobile phone. Among the photos stored on it, one in particular caught his eye, a picture of a tarot card. It was beautifully detailed, an antique design, clearly special. The Empress. As Eddie studied the image, a strange realization stirred in him. He'd seen this style of card before, though he couldn't quite place where. Then it hit him, a recent report about the accidental death of a young man who had been juggling fire. The man had tragically burned to death during a street performance. Among his belongings was a card from the same tarot deck. Eddie leaned back in his chair, the pieces tumbling through his mind. The two deaths were entirely unconnected, one a tragic accident, the other a crime born of desperation. Yet the coincidence of the cards nagged at him. It wasn't enough to raise suspicion, but it was enough to intrigue him. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Some things were better left unexplored. Carefully, he placed the phone back in its evidence bag and filed it away with the rest of Beth's case. But as he closed the cabinet, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that the cards, those strange antique cards, were more than just a coincidence. Remember to like, subscribe, and share to others, so you don't miss an episode.